Thank you. The next item of business is a debate on motion 4286, the name of Liz Smith, on the abolition of the Scottish Funding Council. I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Liz Smith to speak to and move the motion. Ms Smith, 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer, and can I move the motion in my name? Members are very well aware that a large part of the Education Committee's recent work has been the scrutiny of Scotland's education agencies. On the 16th of November, it was the turn of the Scottish Funding Council, and on the 7th of December 2016, we heard from the Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Jobs and Fair Work about the proposed changes to the 4 agencies which deliver skills, enterprise and education functions, including, obviously, the Scottish Funding Council. That day, Keith Brown set out the Scottish Government's vision for Scotland's economic strategy, part of which involved the proposed amalgamation of the 4 enterprise and skills agencies so that there would be, in his words, strengthened support for the nation's economic ambitions. Mr Brown told us that the establishment of an overarching super board was necessary in order to effectively align the services they deliver. He also confirmed, no fewer, I have to say, than 3 times to myself, to Joanne Lamont and to Daniel Johnson, that the individual boards of the current agencies would be abolished, a statement that was then confirmed by John Swinney at the Audit Committee on the 2nd of February, although he was very careful to add that this abolition did not involve the abolition of the Funding Council itself, something that had originally been a concern for our colleges and universities when the merger was first proposed. So there we had it, on record, not from just one Cabinet Secretary, but 2, that the board of the Scottish Funding Council would be abolished. So not surprisingly, this raised further questions from the further and higher education sectors and from MSPs about the justification for this move and on what evidence the proposal was based. We received from Mr Brown, in response to questioning from the convener of the Education Committee, Mr Dornan, a robust outline of the reasons for having an overarching board. He said it would provide much better strategic alignment of the delivery of skills, enterprise and education, a decluttering of the agency landscape, a simplification of the support networks and the removal of the tensions between national and regional delivery. Policy principles which were generally found in favour with University Scotland, Colleges Scotland, Enterprise and Business. But what Mr Brown completely failed to address was the other side of the coin. Exactly why did this strategic alignment mean that the individual agency boards, each with their separate legal status, have to be abolished? What was the evidence for this part of the proposal? My colleagues Tavish Scott and Joanne Lamont both asked Keith Brown for a list of the organisations which supported the replacement of the individual boards with a central board. After intense questioning and what appeared to be an inability to answer the question, it emerged that the only body which the Cabinet Secretary could name was Colleges Scotland. But on further investigation, it transpired that while Colleges Scotland could see merit in a strategic alignment of agency work, they had not made any specific recommendation to abolish the SFC board. Of course, what we know only too well from the 329 submissions made to the consultation and from exchanges in the recent Chamber debate on the Highlands and Islands enterprise, there was no such recommendation from stakeholders to abolish the board. Indeed, I would venture to suggest that a letter arrived on Mr Brown's desk from the current chairman of the Scottish Funding Council Board, specifically advising against the abolition of the Scottish Funding Council Board. And maybe the Scottish Government might like to confirm the existence of that letter, since the attempts via parliamentary questions have so far produced nothing but obfuscation. What really happened, we know now, was that the Scottish Government made up its mind before Phase 1 had even begun that the individual boards would be abolished and that they would be replaced by a central board. But the hastily carried out consultation last summer did not flag up any support for this idea. So all we got was don't worry, because in Phase 2, that will allow us to debate what is the best governance structure. Now, unbelievably, ministers could not understand why MSPs and stakeholders were so concerned. But we were surely right to be concerned, a point that was very strongly made by Ross Greer at the committee when he questioned the logic of making up your mind about what's going to happen and then hope that you can find enough evidence to support it. Now, of course, we learn that Lorne Creer is recommending that the individual boards should not be abolished at all, which is definitely not what we were told by Messrs Swinney and Brown. We learn instead of the recommendation that the boards should remain, but they will now be known as delivery boards. The implication being that the existing functions will change. And it is this function change which now becomes the issue. What exactly would a delivery board actually do? In what respect will the powers that they have differ, or more likely be reduced from the powers of the existing boards? And specifically in respect to the SFC, will the board still be a statutory and legal entity? Will it have the powers to be sources of initiative and advice? Will it be able to challenge the Scottish Government in the same way as it does just now and also challenge colleges and universities? Will it be Parliament and not the new strategic board that would have powers to allocate resources to the agencies? And will the Scottish Funding Council continue to have functions way beyond enterprise and skills, such as its research function, which is so crucially important? Because little of this is clear at all. Lorne Crerar, in his recommendations, goes on to state that his proposals will not diminish the responsibilities of each agency. But the term Delivery Board suggests that the responsibilities will certainly change, and he makes clear that there will now be new formal lines of accountability. And it is on this aspect that there is an issue about who will chair the overarching board and who would be accountable to ministers. University Scotland are very clear indeed. In Andrea Nolan's letter to Keith Brown of the 13th of December, she says that there is a need for a statutory, non-ministerial body with responsibility for regulatory and funding issues affecting higher education. And she's also very clear that the body should have a distinct legal personality, completely separate from those bodies with an enterprise and skills remit. Now, the Scottish Government clearly believes that this new proposed structure does not heighten the risk of ONS reclassification, but others are less sure if the chair of the new board is in fact to be a minister. Likewise, the Scottish Government has been very clear that no changes will undermine the autonomy of the higher education sector. But again, cast iron evidence would have to be required to convince the sector that if the chair of the new board is a minister, how that would avoid politically driven reshaping of the sector. And that is exactly why the sector wants the firm guarantee that the Scottish Funding Council board would have the right to question and challenge ministers and institutions as it does now. The long and short, Presiding Officer, is that we have been left with some very considerable inconsistencies between what two Cabinet Secretaries have told us at separate committees, what stakeholders have advised, and what Lorne Crerar is now recommending. It is not at all clear why, in order to have better strategic alignment, you need to unpick the governance structures of all four agencies. There was a complete absence of evidence from Phase 1, which supports the Scottish Government's intention, and now there's real concern about where on earth the Scottish Government is going. And I would suggest that it is this aspect of the whole debacle which is causing greatest concern. The Scottish Government, in recommending better strategic realignment of enterprise and skills in education, has got completely carried away with the theory and not thought through what the practice would involve, exactly what it did when it meddled in university governance. Presiding Officer, the message from this Parliament regarding the Scottish Government's treatment of the Highlands and Islands enterprise could hardly have been more clear at 5 o'clock on the 18th of January. To suffer one parliamentary defeat may be regarded as misfortune. To suffer two would look like inexcusable carelessness.
Thank you very much. I now call on Shirley-Anne Sumwell to speak to move Amendment 4286.1. Minister, 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'll use today's debate to set out again why the Government is reviewing our enterprise and skills system and to set out the record on our plans for the Funding Council. I'm aware that there is concern and indeed some misunderstanding about the Government's intentions, so I welcome this opportunity to clarify our position. I'm also always happy to work with members to explore constructive ideas about how we can support and maintain sustainable and inclusive economic growth. However, the motion as originally proposed does not promote that ambition, and it presents, at best, a partial view of the Government's position. The motion also provides commentary on the Lorne Crerar report, published just last week. Liz Smith will be aware that the Government is reflecting on the details of the proposals outlined by Professor Crerar, the views of the Ministerial Review Group and those expressed by wider interest in taking forward the development of the Strategic Board. We will continue to listen to members across the Chamber throughout this through constructive discussion on the way forward, and Mr Brown has said he will also make a statement to Parliament on our next steps within the coming weeks. But I'll begin by putting some important facts on the record. The aim of the Enterprise and Skills Review is to take a fresh action to our long-term ambitions, set out in Scotland's economic strategy, to rank in the top quartile of the OECD countries for productivity, equality, well-being and sustainability. We are clear that through greater alignment between the work of those agencies, we will ensure that they share the collective responsibility for making improvements to Scotland's economic performance. The first phase of the review focused on how we can ensure that all our agencies are working together to support our businesses and users of our skill system. Respondents to the call for evidence said that there was a complex and cluttered landscape and that we needed clearer alignment of our services to deliver our national ambitions. That's why we align these key agencies under a strategic-wide Scotland board, while protecting local decision-making, local management and local delivery. Now, in January, Mr Brown asked Professor Lauren Creer, the chair of HIE, to lead discussions with the other agency chairs and interested Ministerial Review Group members to set out a paper on the principles and a potential outline structure for a new strategic board. And I'd like to thank the Funding Council and indeed the other agencies for their helpful participation in that process.
Joanne Lamont.
Just for clarity, was it possible for the Creer report to come out with a view that an overarching board wasn't the right solution? And were they free to make that choice? Or simply they had to decide, once the board was there, how they were going to make it work?
Minister. Well, phase 1 of the Enterprise and Skills Review is complete, and the discussions that have followed from that in phase 2 are about how we enact that phase 1. So we've went through phase 1, we're now in phase 2, and the Creer report was part of that. It very much is a process for both the stakeholders and the agencies to be able to take part in. I want to make some more progress, but I'm happy to give way later on. So the Professor Creer's report has been published, and we're grateful to him for producing this. We note that there has been considerable support for Professor Creer's views from stakeholders, and a recognition of its focus on a collaboration across the agencies is central to success. I would highlight again that the Creer report was published less than a week ago and sets out a number of proposals for the Government to consider. So I invite members to give their views both in this debate and out with to me and the rest of the Government, because we will be going forward in a listening mode until the Cabinet Secretary makes his statement to Parliament. I want to hear those, certainly.
Liz Smith.
Did the Minister tell us whether she was surprised to have the recommendation from Lauren Creer that the boards of the individual agencies would actually exist when the Scottish Government told us that they wouldn't?
Minister.
Well, Professor Creer was asked to work with the other agency chairs to take forward work in phase 2. What Professor Creer does within that and with the chairs is up to him to answer for, but we're very grateful for the work that he's put in and the other agencies as well. But what I can give members full assurance on is that we recognise the value of the Funding Council as a national strategic arm's-length body, providing knowledge and expertise on how we focus our investment across the college and university sector. We will also ensure that any future model supports the Haldane principle that decisions about what to spend research funds on should be made by researchers and not politicians. And Liz Smith did bring up concerns regarding ONS reclassification. Officials have been in very close dialogue with ONS officials over the recent period. They've reviewed the 2016 Act and have been offered advice in relation to the Enterprise and Skills Review. And ONS themselves are satisfied that on the basis of the information available, neither the Act nor the review will impact on whether HE bodies in Scotland are public or private sector. And I hope that that does allay the concerns both within this chamber and within stakeholders. So I see this review as a real opportunity for the Scottish Funding Council, not only to build on its successes, but to focus on driving improvements in the future. The ambitions of the Enterprise and Skills Review are not about the architecture of governance, but about closer alignment and collaboration across the bodies to drive real improvements in outcomes. My focus for the future will be on working with the Funding Council to ensure that we have an absolute and effective focus on our ambitions for excellence and equity in education. And in the meantime, the Funding Council are very much getting on with their important day job. Indeed, just a few weeks ago, they issued their indicative allocations for colleges and universities for 2017-18. So to conclude, we are reviewing our enterprise and skills system because Scotland is performing well, but must do better. We will maintain a national strategic body which allocates funding independently of ministers to our colleges, universities and for research. Presiding Officer, this reform and the setting of key local and national economic ambitions for all our agencies can help put Scotland among the top performing OECD nations, and I will work with MSPs from across the chamber and stakeholders beyond to achieve that goal. I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you. Call Daniel Johnson to open for Labour. 5 minutes, please, Mr Johnson.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The plans from the Scottish Government to create a super board threaten to be unworkable, are certainly unclear, and certainly threatens the independence of our universities. The need to boost this country's productivity and performance is critical. If we believe in a high-wage, high-skill economy, the need to focus on enterprise agencies is vital. But the Phase 1 report of the Enterprise and Skills was disappointing. Beyond broad intent, it failed to articulate what needed to change and only had one clear proposal: the creation of a single, overarching board to control each of the agencies involved in enterprise skills and tertiary education. The creation of this board will create a body of unprecedented scope. The budget will be in the billions and be larger than the government's budgets for police, housing, social security, environment and culture combined. You have to ask, how long are its meetings going to last? They'll certainly need to serve some pretty strong coffee. But the serious question is this: can a single board truly provide governance and guidance to such a diverse and important range of activities? From regional development to academic learning, from scientific research to vocational education, from industrial support to apprenticeships. Some of these clearly and wholly are, just a moment, clearly and are wholly within the domain of productivity and innovation. And of course, universities' role in research and academic understanding does make a contribution to productivity, but its impacts and benefits are much wider than that. By placing them in a governance structure with a productivity focus, there is a very real risk that damage will be done that will not easily be reversed. Of course.
Cabinet Secretary.
Mr Johnson, in the list of different economic activities that he outlines, which I think is a fair and representative summary of the issues that are involved, he essentially sets out the dilemma for the government, because there are connections between all of the different elements of policy that Mr Johnson referred to, and they all, and he admitted it himself in relation to the exception on university research, contribute to productivity within the economy. And that is the objective of the government's review, to create greater alignment in that respect.
Daniel Johnson.
I can get a little time back, but I accept that they touch. But the very real aspect for the universities is that while they touch on productivity, the vast bulk of their scope, I think, lies well beyond the simple, narrow, teleological, utilitarian description that he sets out. But if I can move on to the Career report, which was published last week by Kate Forbes and then later by the Scottish Government, this is an attempt to clarify the solutions, but it simply raises more questions than it answers. For one, it seems to contradict the Deputy First Minister, who revealed in a parliamentary answer that the individual boards would be scrapped. However, according to Career, they will be retained as delivery boards, whatever that means. Importantly, it is hard to see how this new strategic body will streamline at all. Delivery boards, subcommittees and a new super board will mean 2 additional layers of administration that will be created. The report suggests that the board may have the ability to set budgets of the individual agencies, which presents a worrying obfuscation in an already obscure budget process, as we all know too well from recent weeks. Parliament and the public must be able to scrutinise where public money is being spent. The report also makes the very strong suggestion of a ministerial chair. Indeed, there's a special box section that celebrates how well a ministerial chair has worked for the Convention of Highlands and Islands. But the risk is that a ministerial chair will bring with it the prospect that ONS could reclassify the universities as public bodies. Now, I accept that the Minister said that she has assurances from the ONS, and I would hope that in summation that a Minister will pledge to publish that evidence, because I think it's vitally important. Because we have been here before. When colleges were merged, when new central structures were created, we were reassured that their independence would not be altered. Their ability to borrow and hold assets would remain unchanged. But we all know what happened. The impact on universities would be many times greater than that of universities, with millions stripped from their balance sheets and their ability to leverage investment slashed. Our universities are a success story. They help this country well above its weight. They are outstanding in producing spin-out companies. They are many times more effective than universities in the rest of the UK in terms of their ability to attract research funding. Given this track record and this strength, you have to ask, what is the problem that this review is trying to fix? How are our universities impeding productivity in skills development? But most importantly, given their enduring contribution to Scotland, why put them at risk through this misguided, muddled reform of their governance? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I move to the open debate. And a short debate, as you know, time is tight. Speeches of 4 minutes, please. Liam Kerr, followed by James Dorman. Mr Kerr, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. The task of the Scottish Funding Council is to care for and develop the whole system of colleges and universities and their connections with and contribution to Scotland's educational, social and cultural life. The words of Dr John Kemp, Interim Director of the SFC, to the Education Committee on the 16th of November 2016. It is a laudable, positive and forward-looking remit. It is one that surely has the backing of everyone in this chamber. Indeed, everyone who wishes to make our country once again a leader in the field of education and academic achievement. But if that is the task of the SFC, what of its governance? As Liz Smith said, we have had confirmation from 2 Cabinet Secretaries at 2 separate committees that the individual boards of the current agencies, including that of SFC, will be abolished. Indeed, at the Public Audit Committee on the 2nd of February, the Cabinet Secretary for Education and Skills, John Swinney, all but confirmed that the SFC as an entity needs to tread carefully. The following being taken from the official report of the committee that day. Liz Smith. So it is correct to say that there will be a new funding council model. Obviously, the board of the existing funding council is to go. The argument would be that there would have to be a new body. John Swinney. There will be changes to the arrangements under the proposals that have been set out today. Yes. But why? In his letter of 17th of January asking Professor Crerar to chair a review of governance, the Cabinet Secretary stated that stronger governance could best be achieved by creating a single overarching board to ensure robust oversight, evaluation and common targets, which drive hard alignment between our agencies. There does not appear to be any evidence for that statement. Out of 329 submissions made to the consultation on the Enterprise and Skills Review, not one stakeholder recommended the boards be abolished. Under repeated questioning by the Public Audit Committee, Mr Swinney couldn't point to one single piece of evidence that showed the abolishment of the SFC board had been recommended as a solution to governance issues. And now, Professor Crerar has recommended that the individual boards should not be abolished, but be renamed delivery boards, albeit under the direct control of a strategic board. Surely, evidence showing likely achievement of desired outcomes should drive policy, rather than starting with a policy, then trying to make the evidence fit it. Or worse, simply asserting a position without robust evidence to support it. Now, I also recall a debate in January in which were aired fears that the SFC's position as a non-departmental public body operating at arm's length was under threat, as the distance between ministers and the SFC is increasingly blurred. This alongside fears for the independence of the SFC and indeed the independence of our higher education establishments brought by the establishment of an overarching strategic board under ministerial control. Universities Scotland could not have been clearer. We need to make sure universities are independent actors, that we are working in partnership with government but still working as autonomous charities, that we are another force of initiative in society and not being brought into a directive relationship from government. Independence from government could disappear as a result of these changes. The SFC could become another arm of this ever more centralised state. Presiding Officer, the independence of our higher education establishments is sacrosanct, and the proposed changes would likely move us ever closer towards direct government control. It is clear that the government decided long ago, absent any evidence, that an overarching strategic board under ministerial control was the way forward. The government should reflect on why it lost the vote on HIE on the 18th of January, step back from the brink and think long and hard before it proceeds with these proposals. And for that reason, I urge support for the motion today.
Thank you. James Dornan, followed by Joanne Lamont. Mr Dornan, please.
Hello. Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's just I don't want you missing anything.
There's no need to say hello back. Just continue, please.
Yes, sorry, Presiding Officer. The role of the Scottish Funding Council was, as already mentioned by Liz Smith, was explored in the committee's evidence last November, including the importance of being able to demonstrate to the key stakeholders such as universities and colleges where it's performing a challenge function to government. And the discussion on that role highlighted the need for further clarity on the implications on the review on the Scottish Funding Council, given the proposal the board will be replaced by an overarching body. Having heard this, we decided to get the Cabinet Secretary for Economy, Jobs and Fair Work in on this and explored the evidence base. We talked about the process followed by the Government in generating its Phase 1 recommendations and the further work plan for Phase 2. We then wrote to the Cabinet Secretary following the meeting seeking more information on which bodies had suggested the removal of the SFC to be replaced by an overarching body and an overarching board. And I know that's been mentioned here and they say there's no evidence of anybody suggesting such a thing. But if you look at some of the responses in the consultation, the Scottish Enterprise called for the creation of a Scottish Strategic Economic Leadership Board. SDS asked for a National Sustainable Economic Development Board that was permanent, while the University of Strathclyde advocated for a strategic board at Scotland-wide level to exercise strong leadership and reinforce collaboration. 4 minutes, Ms Smith. Whereas College of Scotland stated the need for an overarching enterprise and skills board for Scotland. All suggestions that they were not happy with the way the system was working at present and that they were looking for a more joined-up way of thinking. The Federation for Small Businesses, SCVO, the Scottish Local Authorities Economic Development Group, University Scotland and HIE all suggested that the current system is complex and required greater coordination. All things that I hope that we would all agree is the aim behind what the government are doing. Now, in my opinion, this is not about diluting the power to challenge the institutions that form our further and higher education system, nor about dissolving the autonomy, certainly not about dissolving the autonomy of Scotland's universities. It's about that focus, and it's about ensuring that all the agencies are working together in a coordinated fashion to deliver that top 20%. Yes, I will give way.
Liz Smith.
Disagree, actually, with the statements that you made about that evidence. But that evidence is for about greater collaboration. Where was the evidence about abolition of the individual boards?
James Dornan.
Well, I did mention that in my opening comments, that they might not have asked for the board, but what they did ask for, they clearly asked for an overarching joined-up way of thinking, and that's not what it is at present. So, I mean, we have to remember we're at the end of Phase 1, we're in Phase 2, and for me this is a debate that's too early. And I do think that it's brought, it's not for the purposes of trying to tease out any more information than we've already received. It's about, and I do think that Liz Smith gave the game away just at the very end of it, mentioning HIE and saying that the Scottish Government get defeated there, and this is basically saying this is another opportunity to defeat the Scottish Government. And this should not be about defeating the Scottish Government in something like this. This should be about trying to get the information that you require and getting it the way that it's easiest to get, not about having a debate. There's lots of things in education that could have been debated today. I'm surprised that you picked this one, because this is a process. And we're in the middle of that process just now. And for me, I think we should wait till we're near the end of the process and see what's coming out of Phase 2. The Crerar report was last week. We're in Phase 2 of this. And I think let's wait and see what happens. And then if you've got things you want to call the government on, feel free to do so. And my committee will certainly be doing the same.
Thank you very much. Joanne Lamont, followed by Ross Greer. Ms Lamont, please.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I just say to the convener of the Education Committee, while it is not our job simply to go after the government, it's equally not the job of government backbenchers to protect the government regardless of what proposals they bring forward. The fact of the matter is, this is an unhappy and unconvincing piece of work, hampered by a lack of clarity from the very beginning about the purpose of the review and the actions that would follow it. I think we've been charitable if we said that this has been ill thought through. And we should remember that the consultation and review of enterprise and other bodies took place over 1 month over the summer. That is deeply unsatisfactory, and there was never any explanation given on the need for such a rush. No clarity about why all of a sudden this needed to be done so quickly without bringing people with them. And I think that has been a major problem. No one is going to disagree that we want to have a stronger economy, that we want coherence. But what the government is now doing is conflating that desire with their set of proposals. We shouldn't be divided on the question of wanting a stronger economy and the question of alignment and all the rest of it. What we are dividing on is the proposal being brought forward by the government allegedly to tackle that problem. In an evidence to the Education Committee, there was a spectacular failure, I think, by the Cabinet Secretary for the Economy even to explain what he was trying to do. I would recommend it as a little bit of light reading for you to see a proposal being interrogated and the Cabinet Secretary unable to explain his purpose. He couldn't explain or justify the timing of the consultation. He couldn't provide any evidence of any group or anybody that independently brought forward the solution of an overarching board. Of course, people are agreeing there is a problem. No one suggested this as the solution and was unable to give any clarity about what would happen to the Scottish Funding Council. Indeed, seemed rather vague about its role in relation to education, if not to enterprise. Now, we all agree that decluttering in itself is a good thing, but it is important that people talk to each other and work with each other. But we also know, all the evidence tells us, that you need to have decisions made as locally as possible. Local economic circumstances or pressure are different throughout the country. In our remote and rural areas, they're tackling the question of depopulation, the potential for the use of the internet. Inner city Glasgow, a very different set of problems. So why create the sense that there is only one model that fits our enterprise and skills agenda? That, to me, is utter nonsense. And goodness me, can people not simply talk to each other? The reality is this. The Scottish Government started from the end. They wanted an overarching board. And then, since then, all we have seen is post hoc rationalisation to justify it. And now, in the face of pressure and concerns, they're shifting the argument. We are getting rid of all the boards. We're not getting rid of all the boards. HIE is going to have complete and utter control, but it's not going to have complete and utter control because there's going to be an overarching board. And when you say we're in the middle of a process, the fact of the matter is we've got a stage one, which said what the Scottish Government, without any evidence, wanted. And stage two is now about finding a way to implement that. That is not the way to take this work forward. It was most obvious in relation to the Funding Council that the legal responsibilities had not even been thought about. And I do think we recognise the need for coordination, but I personally think that is the job of government. It's the job of government to do cross-portfolio thinking, making sure that people are working together. And I would make a plea to the government. In the first, since after 2007, the government got rid of Community Scotland. We lost all of that expertise in relation to housing that could take to the government advice, information, skills on how a housing agency could develop our work. I think that was a loss. And losing the capability of these bodies to speak powerfully to government, maybe not in the public, but giving advice, strategic understanding and their expertise, I genuinely believe is an absolute loss. And I do not understand...
No, I'm sorry, Ms Lamont. Could you please just conclude?
I would conclude by saying I do urge the Scottish Government to think again, and if you do that, I'm sure across the board people will support you.
Thank you very much. Ross Greer to be followed by Tavish Scott. Mr Greer, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Back in January, I said I was disappointed with the government's pursuit of centralisation at any cost without providing the evidence, and 2 months later, nothing has changed. Concerns have been raised time and again. They've come from across the political spectrum, from our partners in education, such as the UCU and University Scotland, and by experts such as the Royal Society of Edinburgh. What we're all concerned about is significant changes being made to the university sector without their implications being properly thought through or evidenced. And despite it being an area of acute and widely held concern, the government has still not ruled out a minister chairing the new super board, though today does provide an opportunity for them to do so. The aim of these reforms is clear, to focus the efforts of these bodies towards economic strategy. But it does also increase government influence over and proximity to them, and it is worth noting that economic development is not the sole purpose of all four of these organisations. The new report for the government by Professor Crerar is welcome, but it continues the centralisation agenda, and it has done little to allay concerns. It has called for the new super board to have clear authority to enforce change, and for the transformation of the existing agency boards into mere conduits for delivery. The option of the super board being chaired by a minister remains open. Why, with such significant concerns about this proposal, the government cannot at least offer a gesture of goodwill by ruling out a ministerial chair is beyond me. There are two key concerns, though, about the impact that these reforms will have on Scottish universities. Their status not classified as public bodies and their freedom to determine their own academic goals. With this in mind, an increase in government control over the SFC, or at least a strong appearance of this, would be irresponsible. And I hear what the Minister has said about dialogue with the Office for National Statistics, but bearing in mind that the Education Committee has asked for this evidence repeatedly, it would be fantastic if we could see that as well. Such a reclassification could seriously harm the ability of Scottish universities to attract funding, for example, from charitable bodies, particularly those based down south. And these are concerns that the Government are well aware of. The committee published a report stating that the ability of the Funding Council to develop and initiate policy itself is key to its ability to function, and that it's of vital importance that universities are not reclassified as public bodies. Both the Cabinet Secretaries for Economy, Jobs and Fair Work and for Education and Skills, in their appearances before our committee, were unable to provide anything approaching evidence of the effect this Superboard proposal could have on research funding. Nor was sufficient evidence brought forward to back up the supposed demands for such a centralised board, as members have already mentioned. This brought into question not just the proposal itself, but the process by which we have got to this point, which I will touch on quickly. But these government reforms not only threaten the status and the funding of Scottish universities, they also raise the question of their purpose. Are Scottish universities to be simply another tool in our economic strategy? No, this is not the ethos that underpinned the academic and intellectual freedom of our universities since the Enlightenment. And again, this was noted by the Education Committee in our report. Significant elements of the roles these agencies fulfil are out with the scope of this review, and the committee recommended the government quickly set out what impact the review would have on areas out with its scope. But the issue of evidence has been key to me here. The government has simply been unable to provide it, and it's at the nub of the issue with the process. In stage one, the government decided to embark on this route towards a superboard, giving themselves no wriggle room to back out of it. But there seems to be no evidence of what the effect will be, for example, on university research funding. That is apparently for phase two. The Cabinet Secretary for Education did concede in committee that there are relevant policy considerations for phase one, but they were not evidenced in phase one. To make a clear decision to pursue a policy without having first gathered evidence of its effects is not responsible.
You must conclude. Sorry,
Mr.
Greer.
And the Greens are not prepared at this point to support it.
Thank you very much. Tavish Scott, to be followed by Jenny Gilruth. Mr. Scott, please.
Deputy Presiding Officer. I want to thank Liz Smith for bringing this debate to Parliament this afternoon, not least of which because it does give us a chance to look at the Crerar report and the implications of that, and also because last Thursday the Presiding Officer ruled, in response to the points of orders that were made about the publication of the Crerar report, that the Government should respond to that. Well, the first chance we had was yesterday, and the Government did not respond to that, so today is the first chance we have. It happens to be in opposition time, but I think Parliament will notice that the Government have chosen not yet to bring forward any opportunity in their own time for us to debate these matters. I also want to say that, the Crerar report does need some careful examination because it says some very profound things about how we actually run our country. If you as the Government, and this could be of any government, wish to control from the centre, then do the honest thing and just abolish these boards and abolish the whole organisation altogether. Because the logic of what ministers may or may not want is to have these organisations in-house. Read very carefully what Crerar actually says. What he says on the delivery boards, and the word is descriptive and very clear, is that all board members will be required to take direction from the chair of the board, ensuring, and I quote, hard alignment with the other agencies and others to meet the aims and aspirations of the board, of the strategic board. The repurposed delivery boards, repurposed must be a word I was never taught in English at school, but anyway, the repurposed delivery boards should fulfil the functions described and ensure that the aims of the strategic board can be delivered effectively while also ensuring governance standards are maintained. Well, it is crystal clear if government implement this report, Presiding Officer, what will happen to the Funding Council. And you actually have to get to page 28 out of 31 before there's even mention of the Funding Council in the Crerar report. So even in that, there is no analysis whatsoever of the different types of function that these organisations undertake. And in the conclusions and recommendations of the Crerar report, it says, and I quote, the through the board, the strategic board, there will be direct accountability to Scottish ministers for the collective responsibility of each agency. Now, how that is consistent, presiding officer, with the words that have been spoken by ministers about the independence, the academic independence and other independence of the Funding Council is quite beyond me. So I listened very carefully to what the Minister said in her remarks in response to Liz Smith. And she said that ministers were now reflecting on the Crerar report and therefore they would decide in the fullness of time what they were going to do about it. So that actually means that not that they, yes, have the Crerar report, but they could go back to their original position, as Liz Smith illustrated earlier, of abolishing all 4 boards. That was not even clear from the ministerial introduction to this afternoon's debate. So I think we need to be very clear about the dangers that those who articulate on behalf of the university and college sector have made clear in response to this debate. University of Scotland say today that we seek recognition by the government that the statutory body boards are sources of initiative and advice and challenge to government rather than just a challenge for the delivery of priorities set by the Scottish Government or the strategic board. Again, that is entirely inconsistent with the Crerar report. You cannot have this both ways. You either believe in Crerar, in which case, and implement Crerar, in which case the Funding Council board will not be worth having, nor will the board of High. Interestingly, none of us seem to defend Scottish Enterprise or Skills Development Scotland. I feel kind of sorry for them because they never get a mention in this one. But on the Funding Council and High, those boards will cease to exist other than to do exactly what they are told to do by the Government Minister and by the Strategic Board. That is the choice we have, and Parliament should vote on that this afternoon.
Thank you very much, Mr Scott. Jenny Gilruth, followed by Ross Thompson. Ms Gilruth, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And can I start by reminding members I'm the Parliamentary Liaison Officer to the Cabinet Secretary for Education. In 2014, Scotland was ranked 19th for productivity levels amongst OECD countries, placing us only at the top of the 3rd quartile. In 2013, Scotland was in exactly the same position. More of the same will not get the job done. We know we need to modernise our approach to enterprise and skills development as we work toward moving our productivity into the top quartile of OECD nations. Scotland has had great success in attracting investment and in helping companies to innovate, export and expand. Indeed, £500 million is now being invested by this government through the Scottish Growth Fund. And we know we have real strength in our university sector too, 5 of which rank in the Times Higher Education World University Rankings. But now is not a time for complacency. It is a time to ensure that we drive greater innovation to improve our productivity. Our universities received almost £90 million of research funding a year from EU sources alone, so this is of particular importance in a post-Brexit era. As the Minister has outlined today, the context for today's debate stems from the Enterprise and Skills Review. The results from the public call for evidence identified 4 key themes across the whole system. First of all, the cluttered landscape of the current system. Secondly, the difficulty in accessing support. Thirdly, a perceived tension between national and regional approaches. And lastly, a lack of partnership working. Professor Crear's report, however, is about looking at how we ensure that all our agencies work together in a coordinated way to deliver the maximum impact for our economy. And it is indeed the lack of coordination that was flagged up through the public consultation. Presiding Officer, we see this in the Governance Review of Education right now. Many members in the Chamber today spoke in the Education Committee's debate recently, which considered the role of Education Scotland, the SQA, Skills Development Scotland and, of course, the Scottish Funding Council. These agencies are being held to account by the work of that committee, and rightly so. But let's not forget the Scottish Funding Council benefited from over £1.7 billion of Scottish Government funding last year. Public money. Now, of course, we need a national body for FE and HE to allocate funding, and that has to be done independently of Scottish ministers. Fundamentally, however, the establishment of an overarching board will not affect the autonomy of Scotland's universities or how they are governed. This government is absolutely committed to ensuring that academic freedom continues to be protected. I'm really short for time, so no, thank you. Indeed, only 4 months ago, the Deputy First Minister said in this chamber, I can give that absolute cast-iron commitment to Parliament today, there will be no government control of universities. Furthermore, it was this SNP government that strengthened the definition of academic freedom in the 2016 Higher Education Governance Act. But let's reflect on where we are. The status quo isn't working. Look at the OECD statistics. We need Scotland to be sector leading, and the current arrangements do not allow us to do so. It's also important to note that the Enterprise and Skills Review is not just about governance. There are 9 other action points the review considers, including recognising national and regional differences, as Joanne Lamont has mentioned today, promoting an open and international economy, developing innovation, and how skills provision will drive economic success. There is, of course, ongoing dialogue between the Scottish Government and the SFC around the Enterprise and Skills Review, but this is only phase 2 of the review. I very much look forward, as I'm sure all MSPs do, to hearing from the Cabinet Secretary when he returns to Parliament to update us all about what actions the Government intends to take forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Ross Thompson, to be followed by Tom Arthur. Mr Thompson, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It appears that before stage 1 of the Enterprise and Skills Review was even on the books, the Scottish Government had already made up its mind. There is going to be a strategic alignment of the delivery of skills, enterprise and education. And as has been confirmed by the Government and 2 of its Cabinet Secretaries, one of them missing this afternoon, it means the abolition of the SFC board, as well as the boards of the other agencies, and their replacement by a strategic board. A decision taken without the evidence to justify it. Therefore, there is only one way to see this, as yet again another centralising power grab from the Scottish Government. There is a fundamental inconsistency at the heart of the Scottish Government's argument for abolishing the SFC board. As UCU Scotland have highlighted, you simply cannot, on one hand, acknowledge the need for the responsible autonomy and independence of universities and the need for the SFC to be at arm's length from ministers, and then virtually in the same breath talk about the new super board being chaired by a government minister, having power to enforce its view on the SFC, creating the legitimate concern of a puppet board at the mercy of the political will and whim of the Scottish Government. Now, I welcome the minister's update around the classification. However, I'm sure she will be happy to provide that to Parliament, and if she has that in writing, provide that to Parliament, because there is a genuine concern that the proposed abolition of the SFC board potentially risks the autonomy and the independence of our educational institutions. And I'm sure the Minister would agree that the risk of reclassification to the public sector would be catastrophic for our universities' capacity to attract investment to Scotland and their financial sustainability more broadly. Now, at a meeting of the Public Audit Committee on the 2nd of February, the Cabinet Secretary refused to fully commit to dropping the reorganisation plans, even if they would risk reclassification. UCU Scotland have echoed this sentiment, stating, and I quote, "This is a very real concern, and we must ensure the arm's-length, non-departmental public body status of the SFC is retained in more than just name." Therefore, I hope that today we will get that cast-iron guarantee from the Government, because that would be welcome. Now, Deputy Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government is taking, in my view, a reckless, cavalier attitude to the autonomy and sustainability of our universities, which is both irresponsible and dangerous. Simply put, these proposals have significant implications for the ability of our universities to continue to provide the excellent, globally renowned education which they do across Scotland. As I mentioned earlier, the Scottish Government's proposal is void of any compelling basis in evidence. The Cabinet Secretary at Public Audit Committee said that what drives the Enterprise and Skill Review is the fact that the Scottish economy is not performing in the top quartile of productivity assessments. However, it's abundantly clear from the work of both committees, Public Audit and Education, that decisions have been taken to abolish the SFC board and other agency boards, totally failing in tangible evidence. Ministers have to date completely failed to detail what evidence or advice that they have received to support the abolition of the SFC in its current format. Deputy Presiding Officer, it's clear from the work of this Parliament that the Government's proposals are far from transparent. But what is also clear is that the Scottish Government's centralising reforms are unwanted, unnecessary and uncorroborated. I therefore urge members to support the motion in the name of Liz Smith today.
Thank you very much. I call Tom Arthur, last speaker in the open debate. Mr Arthur.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am pleased to have the opportunity to contribute to this afternoon's debate and support the amendment in the name of Shirley-Ann Somerville. I've been struck listening to the proceedings and the wider conversation provoked by the Phase 1 report of the Enterprise and Skills Review by the water-like habit of politics to find and amplify the smallest of fissures in our deliberations. While I would never challenge the primacy of the dialectic in our discourse, we can only make progress through debates such as this if we resist the temptation to indulge in the narcissism of small differences. I fear, however, that on the question of a strategic board...
Please sit down, Simon.
I fear, however, if I had more time I would. I fear, however, that on the question of a strategic board, that is exactly what some of the opposition are in danger of doing. Now, this would be a reckless approach at any time, but it's particularly so given the economic headwinds we face as a consequence of Brexit and the importance of enterprise and skills to realising the Scottish Government's economic strategy. It is also disappointing because there is, in my opinion, an opportunity for consensus being missed. Presiding Officer, I believe, or at least I hope, that all parties in this chamber are united in support of the Government's vision of a Scotland that ranks among the top-performing OECD nations for productivity, equality, sustainability and well-being. I'm sorry, I don't have time. I certainly hear, week after week, from opposition members in this place, entreaties for action by this Government to improve Scotland's economic performance. I therefore find it rather disheartening that when presented with substantive proposals to see greater coordination and collaboration between Scotland's enterprise and skills agencies, the response of some opposition has been one of dogmatic resistance to any change whatsoever. I'm sorry, I don't have time. It seems to me that the Conservatives, in tabling this afternoon's debate, have yet again become somewhat delirious from the rarefied heights of second-party status and forgotten that opposition should not be reduced to obstination. It is simply not credible on any matter of policy to demand a response from the Government only to then reflexively reject any proposition put forward by the Government. Presiding Officer, I welcome the vision set out in the Phase 1 report of the Enterprise and Skills Review of greater collaboration and coordination between agencies, and I also welcome the contribution that Professor Crear's report makes to the second phase of the review. I also recognise the importance of the role played by the Scottish Funding Council, and I welcome the Government's amendment, which not only recognises the fundamental importance of the Haldane principle, but also the continuing need for a national body for further and higher education. I believe that while it is vital that we maximise the contributions that universities make towards the development of a highly skilled workforce, it is also important to remember the broader cultural and societal value generated by higher education. When studying music as both an undergraduate and as a postgraduate, I experienced many well-meaning individuals question what economic relevance gaining such a skill set would bring. Indeed, it has become the norm for debates on music education across the UK and beyond to be framed in terms of utility rather than its intrinsic value as an art. Now, while it is imperative that our colleges and universities equip people with skills to compete in a labour market that will become ever more competitive, particularly with the continued advance of robotics and automation, it is equally important to remember that education can be an end in itself and not just a means. Presiding Officer, the approach set out by the Government in their amendment, in my opinion, gets the balance right. We must maximise the use of resources at our disposal to ensure that Scotland has a workforce to meet the challenges of tomorrow and ensure economic growth while preserving independence of a national body for further and higher education.
I'm sorry, there you must stop overrunning your time. I ask call on Ian Gray to close for Labour. 4 minutes, Mr Gray, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Liz Smith started our debate of today by going back a little bit over the process which has brought us to today, but I think it's worth maybe stepping back even a little further prior to the Stage 1 review consultation, because we are here today because of a paragraph in the SNP manifesto which bore all the hallmarks really of a paragraph inserted in a late realisation that the manifesto said nothing about enterprise and skills and it better say something, so a review was placed in there. Having done that, we then find ourselves lumbered with the review, and of course, having had a review, it becomes incumbent on ministers to change something as a result of the review. And thus it was, I think, that without evidence, and actually much to the surprise, I think, of many of those involved in the Stage 1 review, we ended up with the proposal of the overarching super board. We've now moved on to the Crerar report, which is good, I think, in the sense that it insists we keep the subsidiary boards, including the Funding Council. But of course, it does appear to support the overarching super board. However, as Joanne Lamont, I think, exposed rather neatly, the fact of the matter is Lord Crerar was given that as a given and then asked to work on how that structure could be made to work. And his answer was that the other boards had to be reduced in status, because it must be that, reduced in status to delivery boards, that they would lose their capacity to take strategic decisions and perhaps some financial decisions as well, and that they would do the bidding of the overarching strategic board, which I think Professor Crerar does rather think should be chaired by a minister, although he pulls back from actually making that as a recommendation and examines the other possibilities. So the Crerar report leaves us still with the two major concerns that have been expressed ever since the beginning of this process with regard to the Funding Council. Firstly, the potential for a new degree of ministerial control to jeopardise the ONS classification of our university sector. And I heard what the Minister said, and I heard the cast-iron guarantee given by Jenny Gilruth, although I have to ask what position she's in to give us that cast-iron guarantee. But Daniel Johnson is right. We've been here before. We've been here before with colleges, and we've been here before with the Futures Trust as well, where cast-iron guarantees have been given about ONS classification, which have turned out to be simply wrong. But perhaps the more fundamental concern that we still have is the degree to which the autonomy of our universities may be jeopardised. Now, I know the Minister talked about the Haldane principle, and her amendment this evening does that too. But that's not enough. Autonomy is not just about research decisions being made by researchers. Academic and intellectual freedom is a concept much wider than that, much more important than that, which our universities must be able to exercise without fear or favour. And Mr Scott is absolutely right. Hard alignment, as posited in the Crerar report, cannot mean anything except control by the overarching strategic board. It cannot mean anything except a loss of autonomy. I think the UCU summed this up very well in their briefing paper when they say you can't, on the one hand, acknowledge the need for responsible autonomy of universities and the need for the SFC to be arm's length, and then talk about the new super board chaired by a minister having the power to enforce its view. The fundamental error here is a utilitarian understanding of our universities as being solely about driving productivity and economic growth. It is not, that is something that we don't support. It is something the universities don't support, their students don't support, their academics don't support, and their trade unions don't support. This is a fundamentally flawed proposal, and the government should think again.
Thank you. Call on John Swinney to close the Government Cabinet Secretary. 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It might help if I went through for Parliament the policy process that the Government has undertaken here to try to address some of the issues that were underpinning the debate. And it's some of the ground that I went through with the Public Audit Committee when I appeared before the committee some weeks ago. The Government has considered the challenges that were set out by Jenny Gilruth in her contribution about the need to improve economic performance within Scotland and to recognise that it's not what it should be. And Joanne Lamont made the point in her contribution that that was an issue that bound us all together, that we wanted to improve that economic performance. So in asking the question at the start of phase 1 about that performance and about the desire to improve that performance, we had to ask the question, why is that the case? And when we consulted with the Ministerial Review Group and other interested parties, the answers came back about the cluttered landscape and the need for partnership working and the requirement for us to ensure that there was more compatibility between the interventions that were taken forward by different aspects of our economic and skills development community. And from that evidence, the Government came to the conclusion that the most appropriate way of ensuring we got that greater coherence, that we got that greater alignment, was by taking forward the proposals for the Super Board proposal, which were the summation of the Phase 1 conclusions. And the government came to that position, and forgive me 1 second. The issue I rehearsed with Liz Smith, and Liz Smith has talked a lot about the evidence. What the government did was a policy analysis to come to a conclusion about what approach was the right one to take, and we, at the end of that process, came to the conclusion about the importance of securing greater alignment through the work of a super board. And that explains the process the government is going through. I'll give way to Mr. Green.
Ian Gray.
I wanted to pursue the cluttered landscape point, because we are told, I think, or assured, I think, that each of the individual agencies will continue to have delivery boards, but there will be an overarching super strategic board. Surely that's increasing the clutter in the landscape, not decreasing it.
Cabinet Secretary.
What it does is it gives us, Mr. Gray, the opportunity to reconcile some of the issues of overlap and duplication and clutter which emerge over time. And when we look at the areas of responsibility here, when we talk about the journey that is involved for young people when they're working their way through the education system, where it can involve the Skills Development Scotland landscape, the college landscape, the university landscape, the links to the wider business environment involving either HIE or Scottish Enterprise, the areas of potential overlap and the need for greater coherence is illustrated by that very point. And that's why the government came to that conclusion. Now, the relevance of this, of course, is contained in the point that Mr. Johnson raised, which I responded to in the intervention earlier on. Because Mr. Johnson went through, helpfully I thought, a whole range of different elements of the economic system which are key to driving productivity. And of course, they are all the subject of these 4 agencies where the government is intent on creating and securing greater coherence and greater alignment. Of course, I'll get with you.
Liz Smith.
Very grateful to the Cabinet Secretary taking an intervention. I don't think anybody doubts what you have just posited in terms of the need for collaboration and economic ambitions. That is not the point. The point is about where the evidence is to abolish the boards as part of that process. And can I ask again, was it correct that the Chairman of the Scottish Funding Council sent a letter to the Scottish Government advising that the Scottish Funding Council Board should not be abolished?
Cabinet Secretary.
We've involved the agencies in the dialogue around this particular question, but the point I want to make to Liz Smith, and it's helpful that she's made that intervention, because Liz Smith has just said to me, everybody agrees about this necessity for coherence and alignment. But strangely, that doesn't make any appearance in the motion from Liz Smith before Parliament today. Not a word of it. So when Joanne Lamont makes the plea for greater coherence, or Daniel Johnson, or Liz Smith, or Ross Greer, or even Tavish Scott, it doesn't make a single appearance in the motion from Liz Smith today. And that, in a sense, validates, I think, some of the points that Tom Arthur was making. Because what we have here is the opposition, prepared to address one particular element of the governance arrangements that they clearly do not like, and I totally understand that they don't like it, but without coming forward with the route that addresses the need for coherence that will improve the economic performance of Scotland. That is what the government has tried to do in this exercise, and as the Minister made clear in her opening remarks, the government will continue to engage in Parliament. Mr Brown will come back to Parliament with a further statement to set out the government's intention in the response to these issues.
Thank you very much. Now call Donald Cameron to close for Conservatives. 6 minutes, Mr Cameron, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I'm grateful that this debate has occurred. I'm grateful too that I have the chance to participate in it, not least because of the very similar debate that the Scottish Conservatives held about HIE several weeks ago. Now, whilst the SFC and an enterprise agency such as HIE seek to do very different things, there are some common themes. Both benefit from specialist expertise on their boards. Both have been set up with a degree of independence from government, which allows them to operate in a detached yet constructive way. But both, inexplicably, are under threat, as the tentacles of this centralising government once more reach out to bring yet another local body or specialist body under ministerial control. I'd like to turn first to the report of Professor Carrera, which emerged last week. In one sense, the report is to be welcomed insofar as it recognises the value of the independent boards. But the devil, quite truly, is in the detail. Many have already commented about delivery boards and how we risk turning what are robust arm's-length boards into simply an extension of government. Universities Scotland say this would be, and I quote, a detrimental change to their role. Professor Crerar notes that the chair of the strategic board could be ministerial or independent, but the language of his report infers that he would prefer a ministerial-led approach. And in the view of many, that would impair the independence of the boards. Professor Crear's report calls for real hard alignment of agency outcomes and for the culture of collaboration to be embedded. But those agencies who don't conform to this culture should be challenged. These phrases, this language, in my view, all point to centralisation repackaged. So on these benches, we are very sceptical indeed of the Crerar recommendations, notwithstanding its recognition of the principle of retaining independent boards. Now, I accept at face value what Keith Brown said yesterday about considering this report. And I also accept it doesn't represent government policy yet. But many of us are fearful. And given the government's record, and given its centralising instincts, we have good reason to fear. Because questions such as these, they're not about party political affiliation. These points apply to any government of whatever political stripe. Anyone who cares about the workings of democracy should mind about this. It is about how much government should do. It's an issue which goes to the very heart of politics. How far should government step forward and how far should it step back? Because what's there to fear? Scrutiny of government is a normal part of the political process. Of course.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'm grateful to Mr Cameron for giving way, and he sets out a very important analysis about the relationship between government and public bodies and public authority. But there's also another issue about accountability, where people like Mr Cameron will want to hold the government accountable for the economic performance of Scotland. And if the government believes that there are measures we need to take to strengthen that economic performance, does Mr Cameron not understand the role and the right of government to take forward that agenda?
Mr Cameron.
As the opposition, it is our role to hold the government to account. Ministers are answerable to Parliament. They appear in this chamber in committees, week in, week out. And these boards have a similar role too. University Scotland say in their briefing, governance structures need to preserve some independence from government if they are to respect and protect university autonomy. The SFC must remain, and I quote, as a robust arm's-length body capable of providing challenge to both government and higher education institutions. I'd like to quickly address some of the contributions from across the chamber. Ross Thompson, Tavish Scott, Ian Gray spoke of the contradiction at the heart of this. You cannot have it both ways. Either you support academic independence or, following Crerar, you go down the route of centralisation. Ross Greer spoke of the lack of evidence, quite rightly also pointing out that Crerar is continuing centralisation. Daniel Johnson spoke about the extra bureaucratic layers that Crerar proposes. Joanne Lamont spoke powerfully how the Scottish Government have started from the end and worked backwards. Tom Arthur, thoughtful as ever, interesting to hear his desire for consensus, pleading for differences to be resolved, a rejection of dogma, when I've sat through some pretty dogmatic and non-consensual speeches from him. Liam Carr, with his well-deserved reputation for optimism, gave a characteristically optimistic speech. He spoke about the positive remit of SFC and an ambition that we all share, that Scotland's education system should flourish. James Dornan and Jenny Gilruth, they were right, insofar as there is potentially a desire for partnership and streamlining, but it's a giant leap to go from that to an overarching board and either the neutering or the abolition of the independent boards that exist. So I hope that the government do recognise this depth of feeling here, because yet again, the SNP face a choice. Either in the face of widespread opposition, they persist with this wrong-headed plan to impose central government, or they step back from the brink. And I'd like to end by referring to events at the David Hume Institute last night and the First Minister's speech, because there is a very deep irony in what she said and the context of this debate. Let me warn the government, you cannot accuse others of ignoring Scotland's voice when proposals such as these relating to SFC or HIE may potentially silence Scotland's local voices, be they the voices of our universities or our regional communities. You can't allege that others will strip powers from this Parliament when at the very same time you yourself might end up stripping powers from expert bodies such as the SFC. And you cannot talk of a democratic deficit and go on to do something as profoundly undemocratic as centralising bodies such as these under ministerial control.
Thank you. That concludes the debate on the abolition of the Scottish Funding Council Board. It's now time to move on to the next item of business. I'll give a few moments for the front benches to change places. Thank you.